Good morning. This is basically it's an intro Grails talk, but I do hope to cover a lot of different features of Grails, convention over configuration and the GORM DSL and services and transactions and all that different type of stuff, as much as I can. My regular job is I teach software development training classes. So I visit a lot of companies and I teach everything in the Java area or everything related to that, from Java EE stuff to Spring and Hibernate and Groovy and Grails and various other things. I'm also the author of a book called Making Java Groovy. It's a Java Groovy integration book. How can you add Groovy to Java projects to make your life easier, that sort of thing. That's not completely unrelated to this topic. This is going to discuss Grails, and I do have some slides here, and I'm going to show you most of the slides, but the slides are not really the issue. I'm mostly going to go with code on this, and I'm going to do some live coding, but just to make sure that nothing goes wrong, I built a GitHub repository for the code for this particular talk, and I made a series of branches to show different waypoints along the way on the different steps I want to use to discuss Grails and everything, so that if you were to clone the repo or just download, I don't know if downloading the zip would give you all the branches, but if you clone the repo, you can check out the individual branches yourself as well and follow along that way. Or you could do that after the fact, of course. And I don't think I have the repo in the slides, but I'll add it before I send the slides in, but I'll show you where that is. Speaking of which, now, I really don't generally use PowerPoint, but that's what we had here. So I'm going to try to switch back and forth out of it, and we'll see how the projector reacts to that. This is the Grails website, grails.org. And of course, hey, did you know there's this big conference going on? Yeah. But at any rate, Grails has a whole series of success stories. I don't think I need to convince you to look into Grails. I think just the fact that you're here means that you're interested or familiar with it or looking into the features and things like that. I will say that Grails has been growing slowly, kind of like the tide coming in. Each year it seems to make a lot more progress, and then it comes back out a little bit, and then it grows a little bit more. And I find it in more and more companies in my travels over the past few years. British Sky Television was one of the early adopters. I hear they hired basically every Groovy and Grails person in the London area. ESPN has some Grails apps. Netflix, of course, is huge on Grails, except that they're now moving a lot of stuff to Spring Boot. So we'll see. Of course, so is Grails. Grails and Grails 3, as Graham mentioned yesterday, Graham Roche mentioned, is moving to Spring Boot as well. Now, I will give you a couple of preliminary notes here. The first thing is that, come on, that's what I mean by PowerPoint, All right, heck with it. I'll just bring it up like this. Grails is a complete stack framework. Complete stack basically means everything is there, from the web server to the database and everything in between. All the middleware, the transactional capabilities, everything. And what makes Grails interesting is that it's still at this point a traditional Spring Hibernate type of application, but all the transitions have been smoothed out, and they've used Groovy metaprogramming to build DSLs, domain-specific languages, to make it very easy to configure. Back before Grails became popular in the Java world, we would often write traditional Spring Hibernate types of applications, and pardon me, and you could get into issues of jar version number conflicts, or just trying to figure out which versions of what went with something else. And of course, Grails has all that stuff built in under the hood. And the Groovy metaprogramming makes the configuration much, much easier. So it's a set of DSLs. DSL, it's domain-specific language, something that Groovy is very good at. It's for building little languages in order to accomplish something a little bit more interesting. DSLs are kind of all around us. Music notation's a DSL, for example. If you ever scored a baseball game, that's a DSL. Chess notation. You could frankly make the argument that SQL's a DSL, a small language with a single purpose, which is manipulation of relational databases, that sort of thing. It's not really a general purpose programming language, despite what they try to do with it in general. Well, Groovy is used to modify the classes in a Grails application to add methods and to generate interesting features on the fly as needed. So the home page is at grails.org. That's where I was going to right now. And you can see that there's a download here linked to Grails 2.4.3. Let me make that a bit bigger. There's also a Twitter feed for it as well. And there are several versions of Grails going on. Now, I will say that that's fine. That's a good thing. But if you are interested in doing an installation, please consider gvmtool.net. The Groovy Environment Manager. Marco Vermeulen is here. He's the person who wrote this and maintains this, and every Groovy and Grails person should go to Marco and shake his hand for the work he's put into this. It's incredibly useful. GVM is designed to work on environments that support a bash shell, or any kind of Unix shell, actually. And it allows you to switch versions of all of these products on the fly, as well as do new installations easily. Now, for Groovy, I don't really change versions that often. But for Grails, Grails apps are tied to the version that they were created under. And it's usually much easier to switch Grails versions than to try to modify the app. So for example, let me clear this screen here. If I say GVM current, these are the versions of all of those products that I happen to have installed at the moment on my local machine here, with everything from Grails to Gradle to Spring Boot as well. It's all being managed here. Now, if I say GVM list Grails, then these are all the versions of Grails that it knows about. The asterisks are ones I have installed locally over time, and the angle bracket is what I'm currently using right now. So if I wanted to switch to another version of Grails, I'd simply have to go, here, let me move that up, GVM use Grails 2.2.4, and now I'm in Grails 2.2.4. It is that simple. And that's an extremely useful capability. Now, if you're on a Windows box, then it does work with Cygwin. I've done it before with that. I've heard good things about that Baboon shell, B-A-B-U-N, as a new shell for doing Unix-based things inside of Windows. You might want to take a look at that even just for your own interest, other than actually using Grails in it. I'm on a Mac, so of course I'm using it here. Let me switch back to the current version, 2.4.3. And there you go. So that's how easy it is to work with, and that's why I recommend this for any shell or any platform that supports a Unix shell. In fact, you do an installer by running curl and piping it through bash, and you're pretty much ready to go. You do need a certain minimum number of things installed to make this work, and it's very easy to use in general. Okay, now the other thing I want to point out at Grails here is where you get answers to your questions. And I keep meaning to talk to somebody here. This would be the week to do it. It would be better if I think there was a direct link to the user guide. And I'll show you how I get to it, and then I'll show you the link. The link's actually in the slides. If I go to the Learn path here, then down under Reference is a link to documentation. And under Documentation, there's my user guide. So the user guide is actually at grails.org/doc/latest. Here, I can magnify that. See? There's a trick I wanted to mention, by the way. And the trick is that if you're not using, see, this loaded the latest version, 2.4.3. If you're working on any other version of Grails, you just change the word latest to whatever that version is. If I do 2.2.4, now it's reloaded the user guide for Grails 2.2.4. So that's very useful, and I don't know that that's documented anywhere, so more value added for you coming to the talk this morning. At any rate, I'll go to the latest. This is definitely the first place you want to go when you have a question about how to do something in Grails. This is not a bad Grails tutorial as it stands. It's not complete, it doesn't have everything you want to know, but it's very good. And I'll give you a list of references at the end of the slides. Okay, I have a series of books that I would recommend for that sort of thing. But this, you want this bookmarked no matter what you do in Grails. You always want to be able to get to the user guide here, and there's a whole list over here of quick references. Now, what I have done is that I have started up IntelliJ here. There is, of course, Groovy and Grails tool suite. And I suppose this being a conference sponsored by Pivotal and everything, I probably should be using Groovy and Grails tool suite. And I do use it when I don't have a choice. I've been an Eclipse user since version 1. I mean, I've used Eclipse for years and years and years. So when it fails, I generally know where, you know. There is a Groovy plugin for Eclipse, but there's not a Grails plugin for Eclipse by itself. You can add a Groovy plugin to Eclipse if all you want to do is Groovy. If you want to do Grails, then Groovy and Grails Tool Suite includes Grails support, as well as a whole Grails perspective and lots of features and lots of wizards and everything. But it is not the least buggy product I've ever used. I mean, I don't want to say too much about it, but I'm very happy to get away from it and to use something different, to use IntelliJ instead, frankly. Now, I have set this up to use Grails 2.4.3. I want to show you how I would make a completely new project, so I'll demonstrate this. If I say new project, the installation of the various plugins, it says Grails, but they don't mean it. If you say Groovy and you select Grails 2.4.3, or if you don't have that, you click Create and you go browse to where your installation is and set that up. Then you can build your Grails application properly inside IntelliJ. Now, this points out that by default, I'm running under Java 8. Groovy in Java 8 is a work in progress at the moment. You heard something about it last night, in the sense that Groovy 2.3 will run on Java 8 and supports the Java 8 libraries. And if any of the libraries require a Lambda, for example, you can supply a closure and it'll work just fine. But it does not support the additional syntax from Java 8, the method references or the various Lambda syntax mechanisms themselves. So that's not in there, but it will run on Java 8. Now, the other thing you need to know is that Grails includes Groovy inside it. Grails comes with Groovy. And that's a bug and a feature. I mean, it's a feature in the sense that, hey, I don't need to install Groovy in order to run Grails. But it's a bug because you can't change the version of Groovy inside that Grails app either. It doesn't matter what you already have installed. It doesn't matter what you're already running on a server. It will use the Groovy version that's bundled into the Grails application itself. It bundles in the jar file and everything. I can use Java 8 here because the latest version of Grails includes Groovy 2.3 and therefore has Java 8 support. If I back off to an earlier version of Grails, I'll have to switch back to Java 7, or the thing will not run properly. Okay. So if I say that and I'll say next here, then I have to make up the name of an app, which I'll call something dramatic like Hello 2GX. And I want to demonstrate the Hello World program very quickly just to give you a sense of how this works. So I put the project in a location, I say finish, I say I'll make a new window rather than use the existing one, and then it's going to trigger the first of the command line arguments, or the commands rather, which is create app. It's going to build the application itself. Now, Grails is a convention over configuration framework, which means there's lots and lots of conventions, and you need to know what they are, or things will be going on that you don't realize. And one of the things that's true about every Grails app is it has the identical project structure to every other. True about every Grails app is it has the identical project structure to every other one. You can add additional things, but in general, they have the same layout. That's a real nice benefit, in that you can look at any app in your organization or in any of the Grails samples online or whatever, and you already know where everything is, because the layout is identical. This create app command will build that project structure, and you can see it's being executed down here. Environment set to development, and now it's running the application, and it's generating all these subfolders here, as you see. So there is a Grails app folder underneath it, and lib, and now it's grabbing various zip files and building the jar file, and I think we're just about done. I'm waiting for it to say, or to stop saying executing ... down here. And it's finishing the build in a moment. Okay, now it says console, so I can move that out. Now, when you look at a Grails app that you've never seen, the first thing you want to look at is this file here called application.properties. This is in the root of the directory here. Is that font big enough? See that okay? The back. Okay. Now, this is auto-generated, but the reason you look at it is there's two reasons. One is that it shows the version of Grails that this app is working with. And as I say, that's very important. You need to know that. on any Grails app that you're working with. So that's how to find out, is go look at application.properties and it tells you the Grails version. Now the app.name here is actually going to be in the URL. This is what comes after localhost 8080 and then the context root, if you will, is the app name. So even though I did capitalization and everything on the project, I could now go modify this to make it all lowercase, and then that would be the new root context if I wanted to do that. The app version is something that's completely up to you. You can change that. That has to do with the version of this project that you decide. And the only time that comes up is when you generate the output, the WAR file, the web archive that comes from Grails. It'll just have that in the name, and you could remove it if you want. It's only an indicator internally. It's nothing that the client has anything to do with. So I started with that file so that I could see the version and the context root. Now, this project structure is exactly what you would see on the disk as well, and you could see that while there's a source folder and there's a source Groovy and source Java here, those are for things that are not directly Grails, quote, artifacts is the term that they use. Controllers, services, domain classes, etc. This is for any arbitrary Groovy or Java code that you want in the class path. You simply put it in those folders and then they are added to the class path. So anything that you want to use in addition. There is a test folder which has both integration and unit test subdirectories, subfolders in it. Unit tests will be generated every time you use one of the Grails wizards. Integration tests you have to generate on purpose. I have a talk later today on testing in Grails, and I'll talk more about that there. We have a lib folder here where you would think you'd put third-party jar files in that you want in your class path as well, and you'd be right and wrong. The mechanism, the recommended approach has switched. Later in this talk, I'll discuss the idea of plugins and how you can download plugins programmatically or actually by putting something in a configuration file rather than downloading jars and dropping them into the lib folder. Grails app folder has all of the folders in it that we want, especially controllers, domain, and services, as well as views. Now, controllers are pretty intuitive. They receive requests and they play traffic cop and decide where you're going next. Services, I'll talk about later. Again, that has to do with transactions, anything business logic related, the normal layered architecture that we've been using in Java for, well, ever, really, certainly the last 15 years. Now, the term domain, though, is the one that I imagine if they had a choice, they'd take that back. If you're in the Java EE world, if you're thinking in terms of JPA, for example, then the term, instead of domain, would be entity. These are classes that map to database tables. That's one of the conventions. If you put a class in the domain folder, it will map to a database table. You have no choice on that. If you don't want it to map to a table, then don't put it in the domain folder, for example. You put under source Groovy or whatever you like. So they call it domain, and domain has an image in our head of representing the domain model for an application where not necessarily every class would map to a database table. You know, it's much more just the generic domain model for our system. Here, though, the word domain specifically means maps to a database table. Now, you could customize the mapping. You could change the table name. You could change the columns. You could turn things on and off. There's a lot you could do with it, but it still is talking all about our object relational mapping stuff. Now, most of the discussions of Grails that you'll find online start off by saying, well, let me generate a domain class, and then I will, quote, scaffold it. Let me have Grails generate the controllers and views all around it, and watch how much code you get for nothing. You know? Now, I don't know about you, but that generally makes me uncomfortable. I'm like, well, wait a minute, what's really going on here? And I know something about Spring and Hibernate, and it's all hidden. What if something goes wrong? What am I going to see? So what I'm going to do is build a very trivial app just for one controller to show you how Grails does the request-response processing mechanism. And then I'll move on to the larger application. So if I say I want to build a controller, then if I say new here and I want to make a Grails controller, it gives me a name, and you do want to put a package in here. I'll call it S2GX, and I'll call it welcome. And this will be my hello world one. And this is going to build a Groovy class. Now, Grails apps can have Java in them, but most of the classes will be in Groovy. Notice not only did it generate a welcome controller and put it in that package, it also generated a welcome controller spec. This is a Spock test for that controller, and it's under the test unit structure, folder in the file structure. Now we have here a welcome controller, and there's an index action, and when I get back to the slides, which I'll get back to later, I'll point out that basically the job of a controller is to connect URLs to individual methods. Now inside the controller, they refer to those methods with the word actions. So every URL maps to an action, and it's the normal pattern. The pattern is, and I'll even just comment it here, it's that you have some sort of host, and then a port, of course, and then it's the app name, followed by the controller name, followed by the action, followed by ID. And this pattern is the default. This is built in, again, something you can customize if you want, but this is what most people go with in general. Now, controller, action, and ID are all optional. Depends on, I mean, how it behaves depends on which ones are there. Right now, I have an index action so that if I put in localhost 8080, so in this particular case, if I put in, now this is because I'm going to run the internal Tomcat server, localhost 8080/hello2gx/welcome/index, I would go directly to this particular action. Now right now this is doing nothing. Now if you're a Groovy person, the word def is not a big surprise to you. If you're not a Groovy person, that's a data type that is not making any commitments at all. It's a variable data type. You can assign anything to it, including null. So def is used in these controller actions to say we may return something, we may not. We're not going to commit ourselves right at the moment. So inside this action, there are 3 ways to return. I call them the 3 R's. Again, this is in the slides. It's either a render, a redirect, or a return. So here I'll do the return, first of all, is I'll say, I'm sorry, let me do the render, pardon me. If I say render, I'm just going to render, let's make it nice and big, hello2gx, and I'll close the H2, and hey, I've written a line of code, it's probably time to start the server. So let me start up my application here, and we'll see how this part works right away. So render basically takes its argument and writes it directly to the output stream. Now you can write to a view so that it can get a bit more interesting, but also what you could do with a render is you could write out JSON data, you could write out XML data, whatever you prefer. So renders are often used to supply data by itself, whereas what I'm doing is I'm going to render an entire web page, which means, you know, 1 line. And that's not what I would do normally. I just want to show you what a render looks like. And it's taking a moment to compile everything, and now it gives me a link. And when I click on this link, here is my welcome to Grails. Congratulations, you successfully started your first app. Now over here under application status, there's that app version number that was in the properties file. There's the Grails version. There's the Groovy version. So that the Groovy version, again, is tied to the Grails version. This is how I can find out what it is. There's my JVM as well. There's a whole series of plugins built in, including things like, I can't see it right now, but Tomcat's in there, and jQuery is in there, and Hibernate is in there, and various other pieces as well. It'd be nice if they were alphabetized, but this is one of those one-to-many relationships, and in Grails, one-to-manys are saved as a set by default, so there's no predetermined ordering. It's ordered in hash order, whatever order that happens to be. I can get them if I want in an order, but I'm just using the default mechanism here. Now there are 2 controllers that have nothing to do with anything I did. These are based on plugins that have already been added to the default Grails configuration. The asset pipeline plugin is for serving up static assets very quickly. So it's for caching things and serving them up well. This database migration plugin is for evolving databases over time and taking snapshots of them as the database changes. Now that sounds good, and the Ruby on Rails people love that stuff. But in general, I'm working with an existing database, so I don't really need the database migration stuff very much. Here, I'm going to let Grails generate the database, but there are many other things I could do. Here's my welcome controller. Now, when I mouse over that, it says it wants to go to an index action, and when I click on it, the index action replied, hello2gx, and there was the render. So that was exactly how a render works, nothing more complicated than that, nice and simple. So that one's the easy one. So now I want to do a redirect. Now if I want to do a redirect, I need to have something to redirect to. So let me add another action. I'll call it greet, and I'll call string name here. And actually, I want to make one more modification of this before I do that. Let me say I have n is params.name. Now, again, we're hitting a convention almost right off the bat. In Grails, all request parameters are automatically added to a map, a groovy map, called params. Whether this is a GET request or a POST request or what have you, all request parameters are added to a map called params. And then in Groovy, you can access the key of a map using the dot notation. Now, I could use square brackets and put it in quotes, param square bracket quote name. That would be fine as well. And this is what I'd have. And if I change this to hello, $, curly braces, N, then now I could actually greet somebody by name. The problem is that what happens if they don't supply a name? So if I go back here and I go to Welcome Controller, you see it says, let me refresh here. If I put in name equals Dolly, for example, then now it says hello, Dolly. And I've used that name. Now, by the way, if I did a view source on this, you'll see it's just a single line. That's all I have. It really is just generating a web page here. Now, if I go back and I take the name off, then I'm getting hello, nothing. If I take name off entirely, it's hello, null. I don't want that. So this is a perfect opportunity to use something in Groovy known as the Elvis operator. The Elvis operator is a ternary operator where the middle part is left out. So if I say params.name, question mark, see, if I was going to write the ternary operator, I would say, if this is not null and if it is not empty, use it. Otherwise, let me give you a default. So in Groovy, I can just go question mark, colon. I can leave out the middle part and put in a default right here. And the way you read this, again, is it says, if params.name satisfies the Groovy truth, if it is not null and it is not empty and it's not 0, use it. So they didn't have to repeat it in the middle. Otherwise, use Dolly. And now if I come back here and I do index, now it says hello, Dolly. See? The reason it's called Elvis operator is if you look at that on your side, if you tilt your head to the side, you go, oh, Elvis with the curly Q. It's a reach. I get it. I mean, good luck with that. But I'm always happy when it comes up. So thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah. Sorry, I couldn't afford. All right, at any rate, now I need something to redirect to. So instead of, I'm going to change index. So index is going to redirect to greet. So let me take this code. Ever hear of the CAP design pattern, by the way? I think I may have invented it. The CAP design pattern stands for copy and paste. The goal is to take an error in one part of your code and distribute it throughout the whole system, you know? Not too many chuckles this morning. All right. These are the jokes. They don't get much better, you know? Yeah. At any rate, the difference here is, did you notice that I put string name as an argument to the method? In Grails 2 and above, it will take any parameter in the request that matches arguments in the action and fill them in automatically and do type conversions as well. Change to an integer, change to... Now, if it fails, it'll throw an exception. But in this case, I know it's a string, so it's not a problem. So I took off the params dot, and now I have a greet action that should work. So if I go back here and I change this to greet, I'm doing a render. All right, well, let's put a name on it. Oh, that just figures, doesn't it? Save, because normally I don't have to restart, but I suppose it wouldn't hurt to restart here. Yeah, normally you should not have to restart that at all, but I'll do it just to make sure that everything's working okay. While that's going on, I better not do it while it's going on. What I'm going to do is I'm going to change the index action to a redirect, and then that'll be all set with that, and then I'm going to do a return very quickly, and once the return is finished, then I'll show you the bigger app, and I'll switch. I won't be writing code as much as just looking at it at that point. So if I go to greet here, now it's hello, Dolly, and if I take the name off of it, it's still, that's the default. And if I put a different name on it, what's your name? I just need a name. Is it more complicated than that? I'll have Bob. We'll talk later. At any rate, so I put something in simply. Any rate, so greet is working as a render. So now I want to do the redirect. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go redirect, and in the redirect I'll say I'm redirecting to the action called greet, and there you go, all set. Now this looks like index is calling greet, and it's not. What a redirect does is a redirect generates a new URL, and it sends the browser there. If you're a Java person, this is like a response.sendRedirect. I mean, brand new request. So all request parameters that exist are gone. So now if I go back here and go to index, I'm trusting I don't have to restart again. We'll see. Yeah, notice how the URL changed to greet, and I got the default. The problem is that if I say index question mark name equals Dolly, I got to greet, and I lost that. I shouldn't have used name equals Dolly because that was my default. So let me put in index name is Bob. It carried it along. Oh, well, it didn't used to carry it along. It used to be what you had to do is to say params colon params, and then it will pass that along in the generated URL. I think I probably got a cached version is what happened there. So let me try. No, now I know it's going to work. So if I say index name equals, I can't see it. What's your name? Rob. Oh, well, okay. I already have a Bob, so there we go. Yeah, that worked too. Okay, so that's a redirect. A redirect makes a brand new request and then sends the browser to that point. So the third one is a return. So if I say hi, for example, and I go, let's return. Now, here's the part that you need to know. In Groovy, the return keyword is optional. Whatever the last evaluated expression is in the method will be returned automatically, and they'll try to convert it to whatever the return type is. Of course, I just said def. So it'll return it to whatever I want. So if I do this same game with string n is params.name Elvis Dolly. See, I use Elvis as a verb and everything. You know. At any rate, if I say return, well, I'm going to return a map. I'm going to call this key as person, and the value is this value of n that I just created. Now, that's native syntax in Groovy for a map. That's a linked hash map by default. You know it's a map because of the colon separating the keys from the values. So I have defined a key of type string called person, and I've assigned the value to it to be whatever n computed on the previous line. Now, you can put the word return in front of it, and you would not be wrong. And if you feel like, well, I think I'd rather put it in there just to be clear about it, that's fine. But we read a lot more code than we write, and you're going to find lots of people who don't put that in. So I figured it'd be nice to be able to see both ways. So if you see nothing, it's a return. So there's render, redirect, and return. Now, here's the complicated part. Where do you go after a return? Well, a return returns this map. That's true. But where does it send it? We go to a GSP. So this will be return to a GSP, a Groovy server page, with the same name as the action in a folder with the same name as the controller under Grails apps view, or Grails app. Yeah, Grails app view. So when I created that controller, under views down here, I wound up with a folder called welcome. It's empty at the moment. This is going to, so therefore for this particular one, the idea is it would try to redirect to, or not redirect, it would forward, pardon me, it would forward to Grails app views, pardon me, /welcome /hi.gsp. Again, this is the normal pattern for how this works. So I don't have a file called hi.gsp. So if I went there now, I'd get 404 not found. There would be nothing there. And you remember when I first made the control in the first place, there was an index action and it was empty? Well, again, you play that game in your head. Is this a render, a redirect, or a return? Since there's nothing there, it's a return, and it would have returned to index.gsp under the welcome folder in Grails app views, and I don't have an index.gsp. Oh, good. And of course, since I don't have that, I would get, again, a 404 not found. So I don't want that. So because I don't have a hi.gsp, I'm going to now make one. So I'll say, let me give it a new GSP here. I'll call it hi.gsp, and then it created the structure here. And I want to add one piece to the, well, I'll do it without the addition, then I'll make the addition. So this will be my welcome page. And inside the body here, I'm going to go H2, and I'm going to go hello nurse. No, not quite. $ curly braces. And inside the curly braces, I'll refer to that key, person. So if you're thinking Java web apps again, this is like a request dispatcher. This is like a forward off of a request dispatcher. I added something to the request as an attribute. The key was the key in the map, and then the value was the value in the map, send it as an attribute, and then forward it to here. So now if I go back and go hi, and it's just making me restart a lot this morning. I don't know why. But at any rate, it will bring everything up properly with the hello there as I needed it, as I need it. So this one is the one that allows you to forward to an individual GSP. What you'll almost never see in a Grails application is a URL that ends in .gsp. In general, you use this pattern of controller action returns to a GSP. So you will see in Grails controllers empty actions. Their entire purpose is to connect a URL to a view, so that it just goes directly to that view and you grab information. But much more typically, you will see a map inside there that will be passed along. So there's the hi GSP. Notice the URL did not change because it's a forward rather than a redirect. Now the one change I wanted to make to this is I want to copy a line out of this index one. I want this meta tag for the layout. And if I put that in my GSP here inside the header, this will allow this GSP to participate in the same layout that the rest of the website is using. So if I now refresh, now I get the same cascading style sheets and the layout and everything. That's a main layout in the layouts folder, which you can customize for your entire website. Okay? So there's the request response structure. It's not any more complicated than this. There's a controller has a render here and a redirect and a return. And they all look like that. So I'm going to leave that now, although I am going to remember to stop the server because I'm going to switch apps now and I don't want to conflict with it. Now, I would normally write tests for all this. Again, I'll talk more about that later today. So I'm going to leave that alone at this point. This code is not on my website, but I have a small set of Grails exercises that includes this exact exercise, and I will show you that later in my GitHub repo, so that you'll be able to go in. That one you don't necessarily need to clone, just read it. They're all in Markdown anyway. You can just read it right on the website. So I'll show you that at the end of the presentation. So let me close this project, and now I'm back to my Holy Grails app. As I mentioned in the title, this is the quest for the Holy Grails. So all right. Assume that I have already built the application, and in this one I have actually added a domain class. Oh, I called it S12GX this time. That's called Quest. So I have a class called Quest. Now, because this is a domain class, that means there's a database table called Quest. Whatever you need. No, I think we're fine. There's a database table called Quest, and there will be a column in that table called name. And we can see that later. There's no point in seeing it when all I have is one table and one property. When I fill out the domain model, I'll show you those tables because you can actually browse that in a running Grails app, which I'll talk about later. At any rate, this will be mapped to a database. Now, the database is by default in H2, the pure Java file or in-memory based database. In this particular case, the database is in memory. It's being dropped every time I shut down and regenerated every time I start up. Now, we also have here something called a constraints block. The static constraints block is generated in every domain class by default. And what I have done is I've used this attribute as though it was a method. Groovy allows you to leave off parentheses if the arguments are obvious. I mean, I usually think of it as if it's obvious where the parentheses would have gone, you can generally leave them out. That's the basic idea. So this is using name as a method with the constraint blank is assigned to false, meaning you can't just put in empty spaces. You'd have to put in something or it wouldn't work. Now, this I have, and I also, of course, have a test that came from this. And here is my Quest spec, which I'll come back to in a moment. Now, before I look at that, here is the controller as well. And notice my controller is a single line static scaffold equals Quest. This is how most Grails tutorials start. Is they give you a domain class and then they just say, let's scaffold everything, and you're left kind of wondering what's going on in the hood. And that's why I was trying to show you that other one, to give you a sense of how it works. Now let me start this guy up right here. While that's starting, you may notice it's very faint down here. I've got my little magnifier. I've put this in a Git repository, and I have a series of branches numbered 1 through 6, and that's what I'm going to be going through now. in my repository. So I'm simply using branch number 1, which is just the domain class itself with a single test involved, to give you an idea what that looks like. Now this scaffold will generate a controller, a full controller, with like 7 different actions: index, save, edit, create, update, delete. I think that may be it. But at any rate, now notice my new URL here, localhost 8080, Holy Grails 2GX, and here's my quest controller, and this is what the scaffolding buys you. So I clicked on index, and now you see there's a quest list here. And of course, I don't have any at the moment. If I click on new, I'm going to the create action, and that's going to generate a GSP, and now I have a form that has fields that were based on the data types that I put in the domain class. See, I use def on the return types of the controllers, but you don't use def on the domain properties because those need to map to SQL types. So it needs to know what data type to use on that. Now, what the actual mapping is depends on the driver you happen to be using, whichever database you're using. But it's pretty straightforward. Now, the asterisk here and the highlight is because I said blank : false. If I now just try to hit create, I get please fill out this field. Now, that's not really the validation that I'm looking for. What that's actually doing is that's HTML5 validation. That's the fact that if I actually do a view source on this page, and I scroll down to that field, then here, if you can see this, it says input type equals text, name equals name, required equals anything. And if you have a browser that supports HTML5, that means it will not submit unless I type something inside it. Okay, so that's not server-side validation, that's client-side, and that's all HTML5 validation. Now, if I had a browser that did not support HTML5, I would have gotten the server-side validation right away. Now, if I try to put in a couple spaces here, notice the highlight goes away, but when I hit create, I get an error. It says property name of class quest cannot be null, not blank. And that's a change that happened in Grails 2.3. It used to be you could submit something and get the blank error. Instead, I'm getting the null error because now Grails takes any empty string and truncates it and submits a null instead. You can change that behavior, but it surprised me the first time I ran into it. Now, you notice this error message, property name of class whatever quest cannot be null. This error message, of course, is part of my app in the i18n folder. So in the internationalization folder, here's your messages.properties file. And if I bring this up, you'll see the default null message is property 0 of class 1 cannot be null. It's exactly what we saw. I can change that message, and then I'll get the updated error message on the fly if I want. Now, I'm not going to do it here because that actually was a blank error, and I'd rather customize blank stuff, but I want to move on to something else rather than take the time to do that. But this file is used both for error messages and for your traditional internationalization stuff of saying, here's my previous button and my next button, etc., and created messages and stuff. And you can also see that if you spoke French, there's the French ones, and if you spoke Japanese, there's the Japanese one. I don't know how they got those figures in the file like that. That's great. Or Portuguese in Brazil as opposed to Portuguese in Portugal, or Cyrillic even, or I think it's Chinese when they just gave up and did Unicode. So, but these are all built in, and it's the normal Java resource bundle that we've been using for years. It's just already configured to be used properly in here. So that was the quest class. And I put in the blank constraint. Now, as I mentioned, the default testing mechanism now is Spock, and this is a Spock test. It says test for quest, and Spock tests extend a class called spock.lang.specification, and specification basically has a JUnit runner in it. So you can run this under the same mechanism you would use to run JUnit. As I say, later today I have a whole discussion about Grails testing. Let me just show you for the moment what I did here is I made a quest that was valid, and then I said mock for constraints tests on that quest class. What that does is this will allow me to have a validate method on the domain class that checks against the constraints without having Grails running. See, this is a unit test in the sense that the Grails infrastructure is not involved. So I'm running Grails at the moment, but I could shut it down, wouldn't make any difference. And I now have a validate method that will return true if the properties satisfy the constraints and false otherwise. And if it's false, it'll provide an errors map with all the errors in it. So down here, this is what a Spock test looks like. The sample one I just made, I'm saying is valid. So I expect q.validate to return true. And then I break it. Say, oh, the blank name's not valid when q.name is assigned to this. Now, this again is a groovy idiom. I'm not actually accessing the property. I'm calling a set method. Groovy will generate a set name method for the property by default, and that's what I'm invoking. But this is the normal groovy idiom, is to look like you're doing property access when in fact it turns around and does setters and getters whenever you're doing that. Pardon me. So I assigned it to an empty string. Then validate will return false, and I can check in the errors map off of that property that the error, the constraint I violated, is a blank constraint. And I could run this as a test, and you'd see it all ran just fine. So it's very easy to test these things as well. Testing constraints is quite simple to do. OK, now let me move on to the next step. So I want to show you I can change branches at the command prompt here. See, here is my Holy Grails app. And if I say git checkout, well, here, if I say git branch, there are the various branches. So if I go git checkout, I have an alias for it, 2-task. Now I've switched to that branch. And you'll see this will update down here. And now I have, in addition to a quest class, I also have a task class. Now the quest class has been changed. The quest class, which I'll reopen. Oh, OK, that didn't put in the relationship yet. So the quest hasn't changed, but here's a task class. And this is the one I want to show you now. So a task class, a quest is going to have many tasks that you have to do. So I put in a name as an attribute and priority, and then a start date and end date, and a Boolean to say whether it's done or not. So there's my attributes. Now I also put in a transient property, duration, because the duration is computed from the start date and end date. Now what transient means in this context is that Grails will not add the duration column to the task table. So I've avoided actually going to the table structure. I said transient's the opposite of persistent. Don't put it in the database. And I only have a getter method. I don't have a setter method for it. I can still refer to it as duration, but I don't have to. It's a computed value. It's a dependent value on start and end date. Now the constraints down here say, yeah, name is not blank. Now priority, I put in a range. And you may notice up here I set two constants, min and max priority, and use them in the constraints block here. And I'm using a groovy range. Groovy range is two values separated by a pair of dots. It goes from the first from position to the to position by invoking the next method enough times until it gets to the to position inclusive. So I get all the values. This expands to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's, by the way, why I assigned the default to be 3. That way it's valid. If I hadn't assigned it, it would have been 0, and I'd rather default to a valid value. Now, for the start date, I have no constraint at all, and frankly, there's no good reason to put it into the constraints block, except that I'm still using the scaffolding. And in the scaffolding, the order of the fields on the form or on the table will be the order they appear in the constraints block. Otherwise, they'd be alphabetical, and I want start date before end date. So I'm only doing that while I'm doing the scaffolding. Once I'm writing my own view layer, I can take that out. So it's only just for the convenience at this point. Now, completed, likewise, I don't have a constraint on that. True or false are both fine. There's no other value I'm going to put in there. Here's the end date, though, and this one is using a custom validator, and this is a groovy closure, if you haven't seen them before. It looks similar to the Java 8 lambdas, but slightly different. This is a closure that takes two arguments. The arrow, think of a closure like an anonymous method, if you will. It's not quite like that, but it's not wrong to start that way. Think of it as a method body, and then these are the method arguments, value and t here. I did not put data types on them, but you can. There's nothing wrong with that. And the arrow is there to separate the method arguments from the body of the method. And the body of the method says the values supplied for end date must be greater than or equal to the current task's start date. So this is how I can make one property constrained by being based on the value of another property in the same object. All the other constraints are just that constraint at a time, a range constraint or a min or a max or a size. This one is, oh, I want the end date to be greater than or equal to the start date. So that's how you set that up. So that's what's going on in this class now. It's become a bit more interesting. And now if I go back to, oh, I don't think I'm still running. I may still be running here. It says I am, and let's see how well it handled the switch there. Yeah, see, now I have a quest controller and a task controller. The task controller is just scaffolded at this point as well. And if I went to that, you'd see these are in the order of the constraints block, the order they appear in the constraints block. Otherwise, they would have been alphabetical. The scaffolding is a word meant to be taken literally. You don't, you put up scaffolding when you're building a building, but you don't expect it to be there when the building is open to the public. We don't really use scaffolding in Grails in release mode. Just while we're developing, it's an easy way to play around with your domain model until the domain model settles down. That way you don't have to keep updating controllers and views. And it'll generate the forms based on the fields you have and everything. But eventually, people replace the scaffolding with a real view. Here, I'm not going to do that yet. So rather than add a task, although I'll say if I click on New Task here, you will see that the form fields were based on the data types that were provided by my mechanism here. Now, priority came out as a range. There's my initialized one. That's a select field. Start date and end date use these date pickers, and completed was a little checkbox here, which I could select. And then they all work pretty much as expected. OK, now, if all you have is one class and one table, well, most everything will work, right? I mean, if you can't get that to work, you might as well give it up. So it's when you add relationships that life gets complicated on many levels. Okay. This afternoon, that'll get a chuckle, right? Yeah, of course, I'm not using it this afternoon. Oh, well. So here I have just two individual classes which provide individual tables. Now I want to actually look at a relationship between these, and this is where GORM comes into play. Now, since GORM is going to come into play, let me show you something quickly here on the slides. This is the complete stack part of Grails, Tomcat and H2 and Spring and Hibernate. And there was something about the project layout with the controllers, the domain classes, and the services. There's mapping URLs to actions with my 3 Rs. Now in the latest version of Grails, we have respond as well, which also tries to take into account MIME types. So if the MIME type with an accept header said, hey, I wanted JSON data back, it would try to convert to JSON data, for example. But otherwise, right now, I'm just using straight HTML. Nothing special on that. When you save an object, you have to populate it and then run this validation and then put it in the database. So binding assigns the properties from that params map. You have a map-based constructor, can customize this. Validation satisfies the constraints block. You just call validate. You get the built-in constraints, and there's custom ones like I did. And then we do save. But here's the interesting part. Save calls validate automatically. So you don't have to call validate. You call save. And if it wasn't valid, you get back a null. So you have to check for nulls, because by default, it won't throw an exception or report an error or anything like that. It'll just swallow it. So most Grails applications say if object.save is not null, do something. If it is null, we go back to the form and have them improve that. So yeah, here's GORM. Actually, that's Grails Object Relational Mapping. That's from Arena, and no chuckles on that either. I worked hard on that one. Yeah, I mean, there is no Grails Object Relational Mapping, but I know there's a lazy loading joke in there somewhere. But no, moving on. I wanted to use that in the book, and of course, you can't get rights to something like that. At any rate, so here I want to talk about Grails Object Relational Mapping. Now, the mapping idea for GORM is that instead of having to customize your Hibernate files, your mappings and everything, and put in your annotations with the @many to many and all of that, Grails has a has many and a belongs to, and then in addition to that, it will generate a whole series of finder mechanisms for you that will allow you to do queries automatically just by writing code. And the queries are very easy to use, very slick. So coming back here now, let me switch to the relationships one, the relationships branch, and I'll go back to my my editor here, and we've switched to relationships, and now you will see that tasks have a static belongs to block where they belong to a quest. Now what this is doing is the fact that I have the word quest here means it's bidirectional. From a quest, or from a task, I can navigate to its associated quest because this will add an attribute called quest, and this is the data type of type quest inside it. So it looks like a groovy map, but the way it's interpreted by GORM is that it establishes the dependency relationship, and the belongs to establishes the cascade delete relationship. So that in fact, if I delete the quest, the tasks all go. So speaking of quest, The quest now has many in it, which has a map says task : task. This is the collection. This is an attribute of type by default of type set, which holds task instances in it. And this establishes my one-to-many relationship between the two. Now, the other thing that this does is it adds methods like add to tasks or remove from tasks. And whatever word I put in as the name of the attribute, that's what goes after add to. For example, one of the examples in the Grails user guide is an author with a has many that says fiction of type book and nonfiction of type book, so that he has an add to fiction and an add to nonfiction, both. Here I've just got one relationship at the moment. I'll have more later. So the other thing is I want some initial data. So for my initial data, again, my database right now is still in what they call create drop mode. Every time I shut down, the database is being dropped. Every time I start up, it's being regenerated, being recreated. So I don't want to keep populating this over and over again. So I have a file called Bootstrap, and I have used my quest here to seek the Grail, and I did my add to task, which return the quest over and over again each time, and I've added a series of tasks from the movie. And I'm sorry, but if you haven't seen Monty Python and the Holy Grail, you're not really a developer. The whole movie's on YouTube. I mean, you really don't have an excuse. And if you haven't seen it, I do somewhat envy you. You've got a great treat in front of you. I recommend you see it with people who have seen it, especially if alcohol is involved. Very good. But at any rate, here I've got all these tasks I've added. Lobbeth thou thy holy hand grenade of Antioch, yes. And I want to save that. Now that will do the cascade save. That's what the has many does. It'll save the quest and all the associated tasks as well, all using Hibernate. Now this is in the init closure, which is run on startup, and the destroy closure is run on shutdown. I don't really have anything to do on shutdown, but since that's only run on startup, I am going to restart my server this time so that I can get all those tasks inside there. In general, you don't have to do a lot of restarts. It's really gotten very nice over the years. If you significantly modify a domain class, you have to restart, because that's working with the database generation and everything. There's significant changes there. But generally, if you modify a controller or a service, you don't have to. OK, as soon as it comes back, and there it is. So let me go back to the browser, and I'll go back home here. And now if I go to the Quest controller, you can see there is seek the Grail. Now the reason it says that is because in my Quest class here, I also put in a toString method. That's the normal toString override, just like in Java. Notice here the absence of public and private. In Groovy, attributes are private by default, so you don't have to say it. Methods are public by default. You don't have to say that either. And the class is public by default. If you want to change that, you can, but those are defaults that, why haven't we had that in Java all along, And it's just, that's what Groovy does. Groovy is trying to clean up a lot of the things that Java accumulated over the years and go beyond it. At any rate, again, I don't need the return keyword because the last evaluated expression is returned automatically, so this will return the name, and that's what I'm seeing right here. Now, if I click on it, notice I'm at quest/index. If I click on it, I'm now at quest/show/1, controller action ID. Show action and the ID is 1. There's the name, and there's all these tasks. And that looks a little funny, a little hard to read. Well, the reason I'm getting that is on the task class, I use something called an AST transformation in Groovy, at toString, that will generate a toString method for the class at compile time. And include names means that you can see name : priority : start date : and completed : on each one of them. So this is an auto-generated toString method. And you can see all of the tasks associated with the quest. Again, they're not in any particular order. I shouldn't say that. They're not ordered in a sense that we can see because they're added to a set. So they are in order. They're in a hash order. So if I go to let me go to a task here, and you can see there's the priority, start date, end date, and a link to the quest. And if I go to the task list, there they all are, again, and you even get a little bit of pagination down here. If I click on next, there's the additional ones. Embarrassing story. Guillaume Laforge is here, the head of the Groovy project. He's from the Paris area. He has an outrageous French accent. It's wonderful, just like Cedric Champeau does also. And I was doing a talk a couple years ago, and he came up to me afterwards, Guillermo LaForge, and he was saying hi, and I said, okay, I got to do this. One time, please say to me, your mother was a hamster and your father smelt of elderberries? And he stared at me like I'd lost my mind. He had no idea what I was talking about. He knew the movie in French. Oh, geez, oh well. So be it, but I put the task in anyway. Now, the cascade delete relationship is if I go back to my quest here, let me go to the quest, and I have this quest. Now, I can do an edit before I do the delete. I'll do an edit, and you can see now that's a quest/edit/1. I could change the name, and I also have a link down here to add new tasks, which would take me to the creation for the task window, if I want to do that. But if I just say update, sure, it winds up updating it, and now I want to do the delete, and it'll say, are you sure? And I'll say, okay, and the quest is gone, and so are the tasks. Because of the cascade delete relationship, if I go to the task list here, you'll see they've been deleted as well. So we get the cascade save and update automatically, just from the has many. We get the cascade delete from the belongs to, and they were both navigable. Now later, if I have time, I'm going to show you how you can use a console to be able to manipulate the model and be able to do queries and the dynamic finders and everything. But right now what I want to do is switch to the next version, switch to the next branch here. So my next branch is to do the full domain model, which has got okay, hopefully you can follow this, all 4 classes that I have in here. Now I have not changed, let me close these and reopen them. Oops, sorry. What I want to open is now I have a quest and task, and quests, in addition to having many tasks, also have many knights that are performing the quest, and the knight here has a relationship to the quest as an attribute rather than a belongs to. See, the argument is when you finish the quest, you don't line up all the knights against the wall and take them. It doesn't work like that. So this is bidirectional. I do have a reference to the quest, but without a cascade delete. So I can still get there, but it's not a cascade delete relationship. I'm also going to do the same thing with castle. Now, in general, Grails will assume that every attribute is not null in the database. So if I want to say that a knight is allowed to be between quests, if you're just a project tracker with clever names in it, well, mildly clever names in it. At any rate, if I want to say that you could be between quests, down here I put in the constraint nullable is true, so that the quest does not have to be assigned a value. Now up here you can see the title is an in-list constraint, Sir, Lord, King, and Squire. Name is blank, false, and then castle I'm also going to make nullable and put in as a bidirectional relationship, but without the cascade delete. Now for the castles are just named locations, name, city, state, latitude, and longitude. Now the default data type for floating point values in Groovy is big decimal. In Java it's double, but in Groovy it's big decimal. I chose double here deliberately because I want to show you that in the constraints block, the data type of the constraint must match the data type of the attribute, even if the value would have been promoted without a problem. I mean, -90 and 90 are integers. That fits into double. There's no problem there. You still have to put the D on there for double or it will not work. And it'll tell you right away. So again, these are all just name, city, state can't be blank. Latitude is South Pole to North Pole, basically, going from -90 to 90 that way. There's a min and a max constraint. Longitude, I don't have a constraint on. I just wanted it to appear last. Again, once I get rid of the scaffolding, I don't have to use that. Castles have many knights as well. And now if I restart my app here, actually, I think I want to make one more change. Now I'll just go with what I have. So let me restart. Not surprising that it complained. I made significant changes to this guy, and therefore it generally does need to be restarted on that. Notice IntelliJ. This is not a Grails thing, it's an IntelliJ thing. Provides this little domain class dependencies map here. And if I select that, you can see all of the domain classes in a little figure with the one-to-manys and the various properties and everything. Somewhat useful. Certainly if you're looking at something you've never seen before, that can be quite useful. So now if I go back, let me go to the map here, and I'll go back in now. And while that's starting up, Here's my bootstrap again. And in this case, what I did is I added Camelot and I put it in Dallas, you know. I mean, okay. You used to have a football team down here, as I recall. I'm sorry. Hey, my team lost yesterday, too, so I'm a Patriots fan. But Connecticut, so don't think Yankee, think Red Sox. Very important. At any rate, there's King Arthur and Sir Lancelot and Sir Galahad, and, of course, Sir Robin bravely ran away and all of that. So here is my quest controller again, which takes me to the quest, and from the quest I can see this time both tasks and knights as well. My toString method was just title name, so Sir Bedivere or whatever, Bedivere rather, Sir Robin. And then on an individual knight, you could see the link both to the quest and the castle as well. And if I go to the castle, then the castle has many knights, and there's the city-state. Now what's not showing here is the latitude and longitude. And the reason it's not showing is not obvious from here, but it is when I think about it. It's that when you look at the generated GSP, each of these fields is wrapped in an if block to see if it's not null or not 0. And of course, by default, my latitude and longitude are 0. I didn't supply them. That's the thing I'm going to do next, is I'm going to modify my app to compute the latitude and longitude based on the city and state. And I'm going to use the Google geocoder in order to do that. So because they're 0, they're not showing up here. Now, I'd like to change that, but of course I can't right at the moment because I'm still working with the scaffolding. Well, that's about that point is when you say, all right, enough of this scaffolding. I actually want to see the real code. I actually want to see the GSPs and the full controller. Well, you'll see here under controllers, this time, instead of having the scaffolding, like I have for the knight controller, there's the scaffolded knight controller. This is what is generated if you do the generate controller task rather than the create controller task. You get this full set of methods, which is what the dynamic one has been using all along. The difference is now I can edit it. So you see things like, oh, there's my index action, and it takes an integer max, and it says, let's compute that, max Elvis 10, which, of course, if I don't have a max, defaults to 10, min of 10 and 100, sets max parameters, and does a list action, which means give me the first 10 castles. And also, I want to set a property called castle instance count, and then this is one of those GORM-generated methods that returns the total number of castles in the database. The total number. And now here's the fourth R, there's the respond. This says if you're doing a web app, then generate the normal stuff that we've been talking about, the stuff I did in the welcome controller. But if this is a request that has an accept header that's looking for JSON data, then just write out JSON data. See, it will try to follow the MIME type of the request and respond accordingly. Okay, so that's in there. Now notice there's a show action here and a create action to make a new one. This will try to populate it with the params. Here's my save action to say, okay, if it's not null, if it's null, then we didn't find it. See, there's again in Grails 2.2 and earlier, this stuff was written out in a lot more detail. It was easier to follow what's going on. In Grails 2.4, what you have to know is that if you put a castle as the argument, then it's going to take the supplied ID and go look it up in the database and use it inside the method. That is not obvious. You know what I mean? That's the stuff you have to. Somebody got to tell people that. In order to understand it. But that's an innovation in Grails 2.3 and 4, is to say if you just put the domain class as the argument to an action, then it will try to look it up in the database based on the supplied ID inside there. So if it's null, then it wasn't found. If it has errors, then we go back to the create view and show those errors. Then we try to save it right away, which we'll call validate, and therefore return a null if it doesn't work. And then we'll say, oh, with format, if it's a multi-part form, then yes, we got the default created message and go redirect to the show mechanism. Otherwise, show it was created. Again, if we had more time, I'd go through that in detail. There's the edit action. Here's the update action, which also does, it's not obvious anymore. So let me just mention it to you. It also does optimistic locking. Now, this is, again, built on top of Hibernate. Now, Pessimistic locking is if I grab a row in a database and you grab a row in the database, and then I make some changes and then you make some changes, you're going to overwrite my changes without having seen them. That's considered bad. You shouldn't overwrite something you haven't seen. So pessimistic locking would be to lock the row for editing so that nobody else can modify it until you release the lock. And it's called pessimistic because in that case, you're locking even when you don't necessarily need to. You're locking in all cases, not just when there's contention going on. Optimistic locking says, hey, you know what? We can fake this whole locking thing by adding a version column to the database, a version column to every table in the database. What happens is every time a transaction commits on that table, Hibernate increases version by 1. So that now version's in the where clause. And if I save a change on that row, and then you go to save a change on that row, the code goes, wait a minute, the version numbers don't match, somebody else modified this while you were editing, rejects your change and shows you the old one from the database. Or does whatever you decide to customize it with. You can write your own code now. So as an example of this working, let me go back here and say, I'm going to edit this castle. So I go edit, and if I look in the source code here, you will see that in the form itself, where's the form start? Here, method is post, input type equals hidden, this is a put for an update. Here, input type equals hidden, name equals version at value 0. So they're putting the version number inside as a hidden field inside the form, which means that if I take this and I duplicate this window, so now I've got 2 edit windows open at the same time. Here I'm going to change this and move it from Dallas to, how about Waco? I don't know, I'll pick Waco. And now I updated it, and the version number went up by 1. You just can't tell it from here. And of course, this has the wrong one. So if I say, no, we're going to put this in Houston, and I hit enter, oh, it overwrote it. Oh, because they've changed it to transactional. If we didn't do the transactional mechanism here with the unlock, then it would tell me that somebody else has edited this or has updated this while I was editing, and therefore it would reject the change. So this one has been modified to actually enforce the change, but in general, you can implement the optimistic locking however you want on that. In the older versions of Grails, it would have rejected it, but here it allowed it to pass through. Now, one of the things we're not seeing at the moment is the actual SQL. Now, before I go to the SQL, let me show you here, inside of this app, this running app, if I go after Holy Grails and I say DB console, the word, literally, DB console, this is allowing it to connect to the database that I happen to be using on the running Grails app. So now I've got to change this because it has to be my H2 driver. But it works for MySQL, it works for Oracle, it works for SQL Server. And I think the username, I don't even know if it's using one, but I think it's SA and empty. And if I test the connection, yes, I'm there. And if I connect to this, there is your poor man's view on the database, if you will. I can actually look and see there are the properties in the castle, and if I select the castle and say run, you can see there's my data. Notice the version column is now up to 2 because I've made 2 modifications of the properties in that object. If I clear this and then go to, say, night, for example, I can do the same thing. But I can do more than that. I can do inserts, updates, and deletes as well. This is a tiny little GUI right on your database using the same connection that the Grails app is using. The downside is that the app has to run for this to work. I mean, this is running through the application, so if you can't get the app to start, you can't get at it, you know. But it's a nice, convenient way to look at things now. Now, notice they all have IDs as well. That's not written in the domain classes, but they are all there. They're all being used. So you could see them through this mechanism or through a variety of others. This is a great hole in your production server, isn't it? Wonderful to just put in DB. Actually, the way this works is it's only enabled in development mode. But if you look in the user guide, you can enable it in production mode. But then they say, be sure to secure that with some security solution. Yeah, keep that in mind. But it really useful mechanism right here and allows me to see the database and update it. Now, I'm not logging the SQL at the moment. If we had more time, I would show you that as well. You could turn on SQL logging. It's very easy to do. You could see all of it coming out. Instead, I want to show you the next step of this, which is to do a service to do that geocoder stuff, to actually show you the latitudes and longitudes being computed. Now, to do that, here is the Google geocoder. They call this a RESTful web service. That's part of Google Maps, which means it's JavaScript-based if you don't do anything. But I'm using the RESTful API here. So down here is the URL for that. Maps, googleapis.com, Maps API geocode, output and parameters. Output is either JSON or XML, and parameters is the address that I want to geocode. So I'm going to use XML just because it's easy and groovy. Of course, they recommend JSON because they're a JavaScript API, but I'm going to go with the other one. And this is what it looks like when you do it. Let me scroll down to the XML one. So here they put in geocode XML, and the address is, and notice how they took the address, pardon me, and they URL encoded the street, the city, and the state, and joined them all with commas. Now, you can put in a key if you're a business user, but don't really need it anymore, and I don't have to worry about using it in this. It's a free service. You just can't do any posts, puts, or deletes. It's only a, well, some people I know call it a getful web service, because all you can do is get, and of course that means if it's stateless, does that make it a forgetful web service? Yeah, I'm sorry. Moving on. Notice what I get back is this big block of XML here, geocode response with a result, and then down under result is geometry, location, lat, and long. Those are the numbers I want. Now, if you ever had to parse XML with Java, you know what a joy that can be. And I'd have in a DOM tree, I'd have get element by ID, and there's no IDs in there. Or I'd have get elements by tag name, and I could select lat and long. The problem is there are multiple ones, so I need to distinguish between them. That's no fun either. So let me show you what I do in Groovy. So I am now going to switch to 5 is the geocoder. And close this. And now you will see I now have a service, which is my geocoder service. Now, what you don't see in here, well, actually you do. They put the @transactional annotation on the class. This is the same one from Spring. Grails.transaction.transactional is a subclass of Spring's @transactional annotation. So it's same one, just with the Grails enhancements. Every method is operating in a required transaction, and you could use @transactional and change it read-only or propagation types or isolation levels, whatever it is you choose. So here what I'm doing is saying there's the base URL for the geocoding, and then here's my city and state coming from that castle. I put it in a list, and by applying a collect to it, what I'm doing is I'm URL encoding each element. A collect takes a list and produces a new list by transforming each element using the closure. If you're thinking map reduce, this is map. Okay? So I produced a new list by URL encoding the city and state under UTF-8, and then here's my reduce. I join them all with a comma. So I've turned my list into a URL encoded list and then turned it into a string where all the elements are joined with a comma. This is my full URL, that base, and then address equals the encoded thing I just made. Then we use a class in Groovy called an XML slurper, which has a parse method that takes the string URL. It will go to that location, download the XML, convert it to a DOM string, and hand me the root. So this is the root of that DOM tree. I said DOM string, I meant DOM tree. Okay? So now I just walk the tree. Root.result0. In case there's more than one result, just grab the first one. .geometry, .location, and then for the latitude and longitude, go .lat and .long and convert them to doubles. And there you go. Now I do have a test case for this, which says, here's the Dallas latitude and longitude, more or less. I just put Dallas, Texas latitude and longitude in Google, and that's what I got back. And then I made a castle for city and state, and I called the fill-in lat long method and checked that the values were close enough, and that worked out. So then the other thing I can do once the test passes is I could bring up the castle controller, and notice up here what I now have is the injected service. So here's the other place Spring comes in. So Spring is managing the transactions. Spring is managing the Hibernate session factory, if you will. And Spring is also providing dependency injection. You just say def and the name of the service with a lowercase first letter. I mean, if you're a Spring person, this is AutoWire by name, right? And it's, or maybe, well, yeah, with a lowercase first letter right inside there. And now I can use it. So Spring will automatically grab the bean, and all of those services are Spring beans, they're singletons, they're managed by Spring, and it'll plug it in at that spot. So what I did was, is down where I'm about to save it, here, the save method, right before that, I say fill in the latitude and longitude. And also in the update method, that's the delete. When I'm going to update it, again, right before I save it, fill in the latitude and longitude. I also went to the bootstrap and injected the service into the bootstrap, and now in Camelot, I fill in the latitude and longitude, and I put Swamp Castle in Fort Worth. Is that okay? You're okay? No chuckles on that either. Oh, well, I tried. Again, I need to restart the app here because I wanted to read the bootstrap, not for any other reason, you know. There we go. And, oh, I do want to see when it's finished running up there. And now all the castles will have latitudes and longitudes in them automatically. Then the last thing I want to do is to show you the plugins so that I could do a geocoder plugin and put an actual map up there, and then I'll give you some references, and that's where we'll be. Okay, so in the final part of this talk, I'll do that. So, sorry, let's just do it this way. Here is my home here. Let me go back to this. And now if I go to the castle controller, you will see there are the castles that were in my bootstrap with latitudes and longitudes filled in. And this works pretty much all over the world. So if I just give it a name of A or something. And actually, I'll do this. So Greenwich, and I'll put it in Greenwich in the UK, because that'll have a longitude as close to 0 as I can get. And you could do this all over the world, and it makes you look good even though it's Google doing all the work. So again, this is all in the source code repository. Feel free to reuse this as necessary. Okay? So let me go to the last part now, which is that I'll switch to the plugins. All right, and back to my app again. Now, in the project, there's a config file called buildconfig.groovy. And in buildconfig.groovy, now this is really good. I want you to see this. Now this is an IntelliJ thing, so I thank them for that. You see how all of these plugins have been added using strings that look vaguely Maven-like or Gradle-like? This is the recommended way to add plugins to your app. There's a whole list of plugins at grails.org, and it shows you its compile time or runtime or what have you. And down here, I have added the console plugin and the Google visualization plugin. As soon as I pasted it in, it said, hey, Grails config may be outdated. Apply the changes to the project structure. Grails will now, or IntelliJ will tell Grails to go ahead and download the plugin and add it to my project so that I could use it either compile time or runtime or whatever is necessary. Happens automatically. Very nice that way. And the visualization plugin is going to allow me to modify the details here. So let me show you now the service, because I modified the geocoder service slightly. That's my fill-in lat long from before. Here's the headers I need for the Google map that's going to be generated. Here is my collection of dots on the map that come in triples, latitude, longitude, name. See, castle.list retrieves all the castles, transform them into this list of triples, latitude, longitude, name. Now, in the controller, again, I already have this injected in. So in the index action, where I already was sending back the count, I'm saying call that headers method and send back the map columns. Call that data method and send back all those transformed castles all the way through. And now where's this going to go? Again, this is basically a return. It's going to go to index.gsp. Of course, now I have that file. So under views here, under castle, here is index.gsp. And I've added G-visualization, API import, that's what the plugin says. Use this to add in the Google library for doing Google Maps. And then down here, I have a map element pointing to a div called map, show the tooltips, and there's my columns and my data, and I'm done. So now, I don't know if I needed to restart or not. Let me just try it without. If I say home here, and then go to the castle controller again, and yep, I needed to restart, because that was too much of a change for it to make all at once. But as soon as I do that, then I'll be able to navigate to the index page, and you'll see a nice Google map with the dots on them, and I could add new castles, and it all looks really nice. And this, now you could do that with just writing the JavaScript yourself. There's nothing preventing you from doing that. That's perfectly fine. The nice thing about the plugin is that it generated the JavaScript for me, just with a couple of tags, and I had it. OK, so as soon as that's finished, now it does add a lot of files to my application. They're not stored directly with the app. They'll be added as dependencies when I export it as a WAR file at the end there. OK, just about there. And there we go. So now let me go to the castle controller, and it will generate the GSP. And there is my map. And there's the castles below it. And I could mouse over it, and there's Camelot and everything. And I could add new castles or delete or update or whatever, and it will zoom out to hold them all. Very easy to do. So let me summarize. Oh, what the heck. I'll try this again. PowerPoint doesn't get along real well with my Mac, but I'll try it. So at any rate, there was the persistence part. There was your GORM. Well, Gorn anyway. There's your GORM. There's the layered architecture that we're using. Now, this is the traditional. That's basically the layered architecture of every Java web app ever, except for the fact that in Grails, there's no explicit DAO layer. The DAO methods are added to the domain classes using Groovy metaprogramming. Find all, by, date created, greater than, and ID, equal, that sort of thing, all added automatically. That's more of the active record design pattern. I'm going to skip the Hibernate stuff and the open session and view. There's your locking services, which are transactional, the plugins, and then finally, there's topics that we didn't even get a chance to touch on. I'm going to talk about Grails REST tomorrow. So if you're interested in that, I'll talk about that. But here's a list of references. The first 4 are all Grails related. The last 3 are Groovy related. Grails in Action 2nd edition isn't quite out yet. It's in MEEP version, Manning Early Access Program. Glenn Smith isn't here this year, but Peter Ledbrook's wandering around. Definitive Guide to Grails 2 is by Jeff Brown, who is here, and Graham Roche as well, who you saw yesterday. The only problem with the Definitive Guide, DGG2, is that it's on Grails 2.0. So it feels a little dated in parts, whereas Grails in Action 2nd edition is on Grails 2.3, and I think they ran everything under 2.4. They just didn't do anything uniquely 2.4 inside it. Grails 2, a quick start guide by Dave Klein and his son Ben for the 2nd edition. That is a wonderful beginner book. If you're really new to this whole field and you just want to follow an app grow and have a nice, comfortable tutorial, that's a wonderful book for that. And Programming Grails is your deep dive book. That's the one that should be the second Grails book, not your first one. Burt Beckwith did a great job with that. Of course, in the Groovy area, Groovy in Action 2nd edition, whenever that gets finished, that will be the definitive guide. The first version of that is still my favorite technical book all time. Programming Groovy, Venkat Subramaniam's around. It goes into some of the metaprogramming stuff. And then my book is Making Java Groovy. I should tell you, if you want it, that if you use the code, my last name, Kousen, and then the number 37, so all lowercase on my name and then 37, you can get a 37% discount on anything at Manning. Now, Amazon will beat that on a lot, but hey, what the heck, I might as well give you, you came here, I ought to give you that, right? So feel free. I don't get any of that, unfortunately, but so be it. So that's everything. I will hang out in case there are any questions or comments or words of wisdom or heard any better jokes than I'm telling. I'm very interested in hearing that. Otherwise, have a great rest of the oh, wait a minute. One question now? Oh, the GitHub repository. I'm sorry. Let me point you to that. Okay, github.com/my last name, and I can never get rid of that picture because I'll never have that much hair again. Sigh. Any rate, on the repository, there is one called Holy Grails 2GX, and that is the app I just ran through with all the different branches in it. I will update that with any changes that I think of. You'll be able to clone it. You're welcome to it at any time. And then as well, this intro Grails exercises is all written in Markdown. The first one, hellograils.md, so you can just read it from here. That walks you through the Hello World one that I did when we started off. If you don't remember any of this, feel free to send me an email or anything. I think all my contact information is in the basic information on the website for the conference. If not, just look me up. I'm around all week. Okay, thank you very much for coming.